Hello, this video covers Romanesque Europe, so Europe around the year 1100 or so, plus or minus. Romanesque just means Roman-like, but be careful, don't use the term Romanesque just to describe anything that looks ancient Roman. This is a very specific period in the later part of the Middle Ages, just before the Gothic period starts really taking hold. So just be sure that when you're using the term Romanesque, you're only using it to describe this period. Really don't use it to describe something that looks ancient Roman. In general. So it does mean Roman-like in this case, but that means that they're using some of the type of architectural features of ancient Rome. Things like the pure semicircular arch, a lot of masonry or a lot of stonework. So here I have an image of a Roman aqueduct, just giving you an idea of those kind of archways that we're going to see in the Romanesque style of architecture. We also see a clear focus on relics and reliquaries, which had been important in Christianity but really gain a higher level of importance during this period. We'll talk about the Crusades a little bit, which were an important reason for warfare, for interaction, for trade around this time. You have an apocalyptic mood going on, so remember around the year 1000 everyone was very nervous about the end of the world. Well, that kind of mood will continue to survive and stay around for a while. The Romanesque style spreads from France and Spain over to Germany and Italy, so we'll see some examples in all of those countries in this lecture. So starting off, I just want to show an example of a reliquary. This reliquary comes from France, from Conques, which was an important pilgrimage church. This represents Saint Foy, and it includes kind of an amalgam of different materials. So it includes an ancient Roman helmet and cameos. It includes beautiful stones, precious stones, semi-precious stones, similar to the Lindau Gospel covers that we saw in the early medieval lecture. Very ornamented work that celebrates an early Christian martyr and is said to hold her relics, hold these relics of this important martyr. So this was how these relics and reliquaries worked. So the relic is the actual body part inside, or the object that this holy figure was said to have touched, or a garment that maybe they wore. So the relic is actually inside. The reliquary is the case that it would go in. So here we're seeing the reliquary, and the relic is presumably inside. So the idea is that you make it as beautiful as possible to speak highly of these relics, which are real generators of income and of interest in different churches. So if you had a really important relic and reliquary, that meant that you were going to get more visitors, more pilgrims coming to your church. And Conques was an important pilgrimage church, so you would have visitors making their pilgrimages and making sure that they stopped in this church to see some of the important relics and reliquaries there. This is an example of what we call furta sacra, or holy theft. This idea that you can steal a relic and reliquary from another monastery. So these relics were said to have been translated to one spot, or said to have arrived at a site, and then they were stolen by a monk to bring them to Conques. So what would happen is you'd often have a monk who would kind of end up in a monastery. He would wait a while, wait till he could get access to a relic, and then bring it back to his home abbey, or bring it back to his home monastery. So there was definitely a system of taking these relics from one place to another for spiritual reasons, community reasons, possibly monetary reasons too, in order to generate income for one's church. So this is an example of that kind of theft. People also saw problems with this kind of visual richness of the gold and the materials, the stones that were used, that this could be problematic. And there was a Cistercian monk who was quite austere, abbot of Clairvaux. His name is Bernard of Clairvaux. He was very unhappy with some of the worship of relics and reliquaries, that eyes were fixed on relics covered with gold. The thoroughly beautiful image of some male or female saint is exhibited, and that saint is believed to be the more holy, the more highly colored the image is. So this worry about idolatry, about possibly worshiping these images as if they are gods, or just the fact that they look beautiful, that you should worship them, even though there might be other saints that might be more worthy of one's devotion. So these weren't universally appreciated by all. What did these pilgrimage churches look like? Let's have a look at Santiago de Compostela, which would be the most important. It's way at the end of Spain, way in the end of northern Spain. So it really was at the end of the known world at that point. Remember, we haven't arrived in the Americas yet. So this idea that you would make a pilgrimage all the way out to the western coast of Spain, out to where you could pick up this kind of scallop shell, the seashell, that would mark your pilgrimage and mark the fact that you'd made this great effort to arrive at this important church that was sacred to St. James. So if we look here, you can see this is a typical pilgrimage plan where you have radiating chapels, these little bumps sticking out at the end are these radiating chapels where you can easily store relics. Also, you tend to see large barrel vaults done in masonry. So this adds a vaulting like the vaults of the heavens, but also adds a bit of fire protection. So you no longer have flat timber roofs, flat roofs made out of wood. This way you have a vaulted ceiling looking like the heavens, but also it's made of stone, so it protects your church. The downside to this is these are so heavy that they were very worried about poking or piercing the walls with windows. So you tend to see rather small windows or windows with really, really thick sides to them, so you don't get a lot of light in these churches. They tend to be pretty dark and dungeon-like. In this church here, I'm showing you an image where there's quite a bit of artificial illumination, but just to give you a sense of what that would have been like. And Santiago today has had a lot of changes, Baroque additions from much later, so I'm showing you a reconstruction of what the church would have looked like originally. And here I'm just showing you some important elements of Romanesque architecture. So the most important is this ambulatory with radiating chapels, which allows pilgrims to visit, to see the relics without interrupting any of the rituals or liturgy going on in the nave, the area of the crossing square, the side aisle, the area of the transept. And just a quick note, the crossing square really was the way that you would measure different ratios of the church. So for example, this area here between between the column and the pier here, you have an area that would be half the size of the crossing square, and this area in the side aisle is 1/4 the size of the crossing square. So this way all your measurements are related. Carry on. Another thing we tend to see in Romanesque churches is a lot of sculptural decoration, but not the kind of heavy figures that we tend to see in the Roman or Greek period. These figures tend to be a little bit thinner. Remember, the human body's a little bit de-emphasized, a little bit abstracted during this period. It emphasizes spirituality. It also keeps people from having any kind of impure thoughts about the human body when you're inside church. So what we tend to see is along the naves and the side aisles of churches is we see some beautiful sculpted column capitals. So here we're looking into a church at Vézelay, and you can see very traditional Romanesque style barrel vaulting, kind of those alternating voussoirs, which we've seen before. And so one example is Samson and the Lion, which is a story from the Old Testament that may allude to this idea of Christ's struggle or fight with the devil, kind of this idea of like fighting off sin or fighting off challenges, fighting off evil. So these often could be read on multiple levels. Another interesting one is the abduction of Ganymede, which refers back, of course, to a Greco-Roman myth of Zeus spotting a beautiful Trojan youth, Ganymede, and then abducting him and bringing him up to be with the gods, to be on Mount Olympus. And so this is obviously a very odd selection, but it may speak to kind of the dangers of older monks preying on some of the younger boys that were entering the monastery, or just another commentary of ideas of sin in the Christian church at this time. So you can see this bird. Zeus was said to have transformed himself into a bird, into an eagle, to come and grab onto Ganymede here, who you see as this young boy, and then this kind of devilly creature grabbing onto the bird from behind. And then next, a very famous image from the Romanesque period is this idea of the mystic mill. And this also refers back to the idea of having the Old Testament and then kind of refining that as you move into the New Testament in the period of Christ, and this idea of salvation being brought with Christ. So you have Moses here pouring grain, and of course grain would have really been an image that so many individuals here would have been familiar with, this idea of bread being important, grain being important, an important piece of their survival around this time. So you have Moses pouring grain, which symbolizes the Old Testament, into the mill, which is Christ, this idea of he's refining the message, into this sack that the Apostle Paul is collecting. So this idea of transforming the Old Testament, which predicts certain elements of Christ's coming, which tells of certain elements that are relevant when Christ comes, and Christ is going to refine that message through the New Testament and through his arrival and through his offer of salvation. So that is represented there. We also will see it in stained glass windows later on and in other representations in art history. Another representation that we see very frequently is still this idea of the Last Judgment, which of course was very relevant around the year 1000, but remained important until later on. This is a tympanum, which is a semicircular form right above a portal, right above a door to a Romanesque church. This is a church in France, and what's important about it is we know the sculptor. We believe a sculptor named Gislebertus. It says his name, that he did this. He could be, I guess, the patron. That's been, some people suggest that, but he apparently was a very well-known sculptor, had a workshop, and he took credit for some of these works. So we believe that he was probably the sculptor here. These bodies do tend to be more abstract, more elongated, more spiritual in their overall quality. You can see there would have been a little bit of paint applied. There's some pigment that survives. And the main idea here is you have Christ, obviously very powerful, strong, as judge at center. Figures who have been awakened and are waiting for this moment of judgment, kind of hesitantly along the bottom, with little angels kind of hurrying them along, saying, come on, keep moving. And then you have figures being boosted up into heaven, right over here, with the Virgin Mary on this side. So remember, Christ's blessed side is the right side, and more of the negative side is the left side. So, of course, on his left is more of the hellish side, with people being pushed into the hell mouth, people's souls being weighed, and these little devil figures kind of pulling on the scale to manipulate it. So definitely a scarier side here and a more pleasant side here, which would, of course, remind people of judgment as they came into the church. So reminding them to behave themselves. Another reminder of behaving oneself would be this image of Eve, which we see in another portal of the church, in the north portal, in one of the lintels. And what we see here is Eve looking almost like a snake. She's kind of slithering along the ground there, and it's as if she's calling to Adam. We see her calling, and she is represented nude, but strategically covered here. She's grabbing onto the fruit. We see a little snake figure here, but this idea that she is this individual who's inciting sin, who's calling for him, and it's another example of Gislebertus' style sculpture. Demonstrating the kind of spirituality of this time, if we move over to Germany, we see an individual named Hildegard of Bingen, or Hildegard von Bingen. This no longer survives. We see it here as a facsimile, so just a reproduction in color, but gives us a sense of the kind of spiritual moments that people were having at this time, or were said to have been having, the intense experiences, the way they would describe their Christian faith. So Hildegard was one who was said to have received visions. She dictated her visions to a monk, and we see her here in kind of one of those moments. So the architecture she's in is quite abstract. Her drapery is very typical of the time. It doesn't reveal a lot of the body underneath, very stylized drapery folds. And we see her here working away on a wax tablet, trying to feverishly record what's going on, because you see these little almost like flames or fingers coming down on her head. And so she's feverishly writing all this down, and this monk, of course, is trying to catch every word of it as well, just in case she misses something, or in case it's not coming very clearly. So she started receiving these visions very young, and she was a very learned woman. She wrote scientific treatises and composed music, and she's one of the few women that we hear about from this period. So it's interesting to think about her role in this time. We also see the Romanesque style going into places like Italy, very famous series of structures, which would be the cathedral complex at Pisa, most famous for its campanile, or its leaning tower here. But you have that kind of Romanesque style with the emphasis on semicircular arches, although because we are in Italy, we're still seeing a strong influence coming from ancient Roman basilicas with the flat roofs. And in fact, this doesn't have a barrel vault. If you go inside the cathedral, it's a flat roof, but you do have a lot of these semicircular arches. And you can see later on they added Gothic elements like these gables with little crockets sticking out, kind of those prickly elements that we tend to associate with the Gothic period. So the Romanesque style is definitely spreading, and then the Gothic style will spread later on as well. And then finally, we'll stop off in Italy and just briefly look at things like the Bayeux Tapestry, which records the Battle of Hastings, a very important battle in 1066, which was a battle to take over for King Edward. So William, who's named William the Conqueror after he wins, so he's the winner. He was Duke of Normandy, so the area of northern France, and he's going against Harold, Earl of Wessex. And this just records the entire storyline on a tapestry that runs over 200 feet in length. And technically it's more of an embroidery than a tapestry. And then we also have the development of this move towards more of a Gothic style with ribbed groin vaulting, which we see here at Durham Cathedral. So we'll move towards this idea of taller churches with more ornate architecture.